welcome into the Brookline.News podcast. I'm Sam Mintz, editor of Brookline.News. We're an online nonprofit local news outlet covering the town of Brookline, Mass., and I'm here with Jessica Smyser, the executive director of Brookline Interactive Group. How's it going, Jessica?
Hi, Sam. Good to see you.
Good to see you. Let's get into the news.
Yeah, we have a couple of heavy stories to start with, and then a little bit of a lighter, informative one at the end. So we're going to start with what your headline says: a beloved bookstore becomes a flashpoint as differing views on Middle East conflict collide in Brookline. Can you tell us what that's about?
So this is about the Brookline Booksmith. I think everyone in town pretty much knows it. It's a very popular independent bookstore on Harvard Street, right in Coolidge Corner. And it's been at the center of this sort of series of protests and criticism and, emails and calls from people who are sort of questioning or criticizing how the store has handled the Israel-Gaza conflict, basically in terms of the authors that it has platformed in its books and in its events. And it all sort of came to a head when a writer named Ayman Ishmael came earlier in July to talk about his book, which was really about Muslim fatherhood and his own experiences. And so, in the story, we talked to the bookstore, we talked to this writer, we talked to one of the protesters, Sheila Berenson, about, why she was there, what she had been pressing and pushing the Booksmith to do and to change. One of the many, many ways in which this conflict in the Middle East has come to Brookline.
Well, one of the things about the article I really appreciate, and I do encourage people, as always, to read the article, is that you really spoke with a lot of people and got lengthy statements. So you were only able to quote partially the bookstore statement, but reading the whole statement I think is good. Reading the Slate article that you linked to, that Ishmael wrote about his experience, is good. A couple of things that really stood out to me in the article you write: Ishmael wrote at length about this event in conversations with the protesters in Slate, where he is a staff writer. Despite trying to engage in good faith, he, quote, was deeply hurt by the experience. And then in the bookstore statement, throughout our 64 years in Coolidge Corner, we've stood strong fighting censorship and banned book movements. We seek not to take sides, but to provide a safe place. And then they go on to say, these accusations are so hurtful, especially having as Jewish owners from a family in Brookline for over 5 generations. And then finally, the thing I want to point out is a quote from Berenson, who was one of the protesters sitting in the front row at Ishmael's event. She is quoted that she felt that his book did not show compassion for the Israelis who were killed by Hamas. So one of the things that really stood out to me in all of the interviews you did is just the talking about how it's hurtful, talking about the need for more compassion. And it really stands out that in all these comments and in all your interviews about how emotional this topic is. I mean, we often think about it as a political topic, which it is, but it's also a very emotional topic for everyone involved, which makes it, I think, very difficult to report on and also difficult, to parse as a reader.
Yeah, I very much agree with all that, and it's really challenging to report on. I do my best to find balance, to find truth, but this is something that is so personal to people, like you're saying, so emotional, so charged, and I sort of felt like this story is just the latest in a series that we've done. There have been, as you know, debates over a resolution at town meeting about whether Brookline should call for a ceasefire in the Middle East. There have been various acts of crimes, acts of vandalism. In both directions, including, a brick thrown through a Jewish grocery store, a bomb threat to a hotel that flew a Palestinian flag, all here in Brookline. So it's just such an intense, heated topic. And, I think part of what I try to do with a story like this is to just inform and to give people space to express feelings, again, on both sides of this argument. I think it's fair to say are included in our story, and not to try to solve anything, because that is simply not, our role or something that's possible or that we can achieve, but to put information out about how people are experiencing this in their own community. And that's what I hope we did with this story.
Yeah, I think it did. And I think it can help to encourage dialogue, which I think everyone in this story actually really wants. And that stood out too, that everyone you spoke to said, we want to be in dialogue about this. So very interesting story, worth a read. And thank you for writing it. So the next one we're going to talk about is, another kind of challenging topic, which is how neighbors are challenging the town's plan for transitional housing on William Street, citing safety concerns. So can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so this is, again, a really charged, heated story, in a different way, in a way that it hits even closer to home. This is about a property on 16 Williams Street. We've written about it several times this summer. Our intern, Celeste Alcalay, has been doing a great job covering this story as it develops. This home is currently a lodging house with 10 rooms for people with disabilities, but that organization that runs it wants to sell it. They first said they were going to sell it to a private developer who was going to build a luxury duplex. The town stepped in and said, we have this housing covenant, a fancy way of saying we have some rights here, including a right of first refusal to find a different nonprofit or to buy the property itself. Anyways, what's happened is that this organization called Victory Programs Incorporated, which is a Boston nonprofit that runs various sorts of transitional and temporary housing, has been the bid that's really emerged as the most financially feasible, the most sort of recommended by the town to operate this transitional housing facility there on William Street, which is near Coolidge Corner. It's for families specifically. It's usually for mothers who are being reunited with their children who have experienced substance abuse problems in the past, but are, 6 months sober is one of the requirements. And so that has been, really contentious among the town leaders who say this is the best fit of the opportunities for this property. And then of some neighbors who have challenged it and really said, we're worried about safety. We're worried about what this population would mean for this neighborhood, which includes, some senior residences, a lot of older people, and it's led to this really, intense dialogue, including at public meetings.
Well, I read, then learned, I guess for the first time, that Brookline Police Chief Jennifer Pastor is a licensed social worker, which I thought was a really interesting combination of skills. And the police chief did actually speak in support of Victory. And the quote that I thought I wanted to share here is she said, "I do have a dog in this fight. My role is to keep our crime rates low, and I don't have concerns about crime rising with Victory coming in." So I did think that she took pains to point out that she is a police chief and a social worker when making that quote. What did you make of that?
Yeah, I wanted to put that information in there. I think it does make her a powerful voice, on this subject. It's something that she has education and training in, not to invalidate the neighbors', fears or concerns, obviously, but she is the person most tasked with keeping the town safe, with preventing crime, with, keeping order in the streets of Brookline. And, I thought it was a helpful, powerful quote that she came in and sort of said, I don't have any issues with this. And yeah, she is a licensed social worker. She recently finished a master's in social work at Boston College within the last year, I believe. I think it's a really interesting piece of her. I've done a profile sort of interview Q&A with her, and we talked about that a bit. She's worked on various like crisis prevention, programs within BPD as she's come up in her career. So it's very interesting.
As an aside to this particular story, I think the combination of social work training and police training is really good. And I mean, I think police often put into the role of social worker without the training. So I think that's a really good model she's presenting. But to get back to the story, I also thought you made a good point, or your reporter, Celeste, made a good point about how this is also about the fact that this is temporary housing. So the folks who are moving in, they are of a particular demographic and background, which is part of the issue. But then the issue comes up about it being temporary, whether it's a year or 6 months or 2 years. And just the opposition generally to more transient housing, people who are coming in to housing temporarily, whatever their background, and how that's existed, as a point of contention in many different towns and cities.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, it's just interesting thinking about the various options for what this property could become. And the only reason, because it's served as this nonprofit housing is the only reason that there's even an opportunity. It's not a free market, basically. But I do think it's interesting that, initially some of the neighbors had opposed the development of this, duplex, this luxury housing that a developer was planning to put in. And now, I don't know if it's the same ones, but some of them are now saying like, let's let that happen. That would be the, the preferable option. But I think that, again, I want to be fair here. Like there are, of course, legitimate concerns about changing, the population of a neighborhood. You can understand why some of them might be worried about what it would mean for different types of people that have been living there typically to come in. And whether that's the right choice for Brookline is beyond my remit, but I have found it to be a very interesting conversation.
Well, yeah, and often these terms get thrown around. And in this case, NIMBYism was brought up, and I just want to say I really appreciated that you linked to the definition of NIMBY, because I think with language it's so interesting how we start throwing these terms around and forget what it actually means. So, so thank you for doing that.
Just as a little, behind the scenes aside on that, working with Celeste on editing the story, we started to try to like write our own definition of what that phrase or that allegation of NIMBYism means. And then we thought, let's let let someone else define it, let the pros define it, link out for people who want to learn more, because it's a very controversial phrase, I would say.
Yeah, and then the I guess the opposite of that being YIMBY, which is yes in my backyard, and how those terms have become kind of in a way less descriptive and maybe pejorative in a lot of ways.
And yeah, just to say one more thing about that with this story, I do think it raises these really interesting questions of, there are absolutely people who would support, in general, the idea of this sort of housing existing. I think many people think it's vital for recovery, for transitioning towards permanent housing, away from homelessness, away from, wherever they might have been before. And then some of those same people might say this is not the best fit for our neighborhood, for my street. And I think, that's just a reality of the way that some people think about this.
Well, and that leads me to the last thing I want to say about this article is a quote from your article. Several meeting attendees indicated that they felt the town had not kept neighbors adequately informed throughout its deliberation. So once again, we find ourselves looking at a process that maybe people aren't happy with. It's more than the actual issue itself, but an issue with the process that the town takes in addressing some of these issues.
Two thoughts on that, which are not contradictory, but sort of bounce off each other. One is that I think that complaints about process are often used as a method or a tool of challenging, delaying, slowing a process sometimes. And the second thing is that this is actually a rushed process. I don't think actually anyone has denied that. And it's because of, basically the deadlines that are set by this right of first refusal policy that was written in, with the previous owner. There are strict deadlines about when this sale would have to be done, and they're coming up. And so I think the town leaders who are running this have acknowledged in an ideal world, they might not be moving this quickly.
Well, a complex issue, reported well, so thank you for that. And the last story we're going to talk about is you just published a Q&A with Bella Wong, who is going to be or already is in place as the interim superintendent of Brookline Public Schools.
Yeah, and I think this one is worth highlighting just because it's, school is coming back up. It's starting in just a few weeks as we record. A new school year brings new challenges, new questions, new issues. The summer's a little slow for school news from our end. We've been working on some bigger, investigative stories. More to come on that soon, I hope. But this is sort of a signal like, hey, school is back. Like, you should be paying attention to this again. There's a new leader of the district in this really challenging time around budget, around things like equity, where the equity office was cut, around, a teacher contract, which is coming up in August 2026 is when the current teacher's contract expires. We don't have to get into any specifics because I think people who are interested in Brookline schools should read the story, but it's a chance to sort of see how the new leader is thinking about some of these things. She did basically say that, she's only intending to stay for the 1 year. She's not intending to take on the permanent position, at least how I interpret her comments. So it's an interesting transitional time, and I think it's worth a read if you have kids or are otherwise interested in Brookline schools.
Well, we know people in Brookline are interested in schools, so everyone should check that out. So that's the stories we're going to talk about today. I just wanted to throw in a reminder that this podcast is now available on just about every platform that you listen to podcasts on, including Apple, Spotify, YouTube. And if you're interested in podcasting yourself, you can go ahead and visit us here at Big, because we've got this beautiful podcast studio that you can come and hang out on and talk to friends in and interview people and tell your stories.
It's a great setup here. Highly recommend it. And I'll throw in my pitch that you should visit www.Brookline.News for more stories like the ones we're talking about, to keep up with our publishing, to sign up for a newsletter, and otherwise stay informed about Brookline.